Chronicles.com. Thanks for joining us. This is another edition of What's the Story? I am your host, Joe Painter, and I wanted to know what's the story with the cookie doctor. Who is the cookie doctor? Here's the book. And I just finished reading the book, and I was very sad because I didn't want it to end. And I would like to say, welcome. You are the cookie doctor, and it is my distinct pleasure, Dr. Pugliese, to have you here on What's the Story. World-renowned doctor. And that is a true statement. And it all started, I have to be honest with you. I did a quick Google search, even after having met you and knowing your daughter, Patty, for a very long time and read the book. I thought, I just want to see. And this article came up, and it said, something happened on the way to being a priest. And I had to giggle because you talk about that. I thought that's how they started it. Your journey started so long ago, and it was to be a priest.
Yes, 1943.
And you talk about that in The Cookie Doctor.
Yes, and that was the first step on the road, but I had no idea at that time that I would change and go into medicine.
Into medicine and then into skincare, which is...
Skincare and aging and molecular biology and pathways that I, at that time, never knew existed. And I think all the scientists in the world had no idea of molecular biology back in the 40s. It was very much an infinite type of science. As a matter of fact, DNA, you didn't hear of DNA until the 50s.
Really?
There were only a few papers written on DNA. Today, I don't think 2 libraries would hold the papers that are actually been written. But there were very few papers because we didn't really understand DNA. The molecular code wasn't known. You know, the genetics was still fairly crude, even though fairly advanced. It's still, from today's point of view, very crude. We didn't know about purines and pyrimidines and bases and sequences and all those things.
You have an insatiable curiosity. Insatiable. I detected in the book, and I think at one point you wanted to, you didn't envision yourself as a general practitioner, rather pathology and research?
Yes, I really started out in my whole years in medical school was to be a hematologist, but more in the pathology of blood diseases, which is what hematology is about. And
why? What attracted you to that?
I was doing actually a research project on a condition known as multiple myeloma, which is a disease of the blood. And it was a lot of ramifications here, but I was very intrigued by that because I came across a cell that was a lymphocyte, which I found out actually turned into a plasma cell, which was able to secrete an antibody, a protein, actually a globulin.
And you discovered this in the lab?
And yes, and I wanted to pursue that, and it's hard to find. There aren't that many people with myeloma.
It sounds like something that you don't want to have either.
No, it's
okay.
It's always fatal. Now, they can keep you alive a long time. I actually knew a woman with myeloma who later became pregnant, which is very, very rare. And I had never seen one before. But that was the genesis of my becoming interested in science and for medical school. The other thing was that actually, I found very few diseases were amenable to treatment. You know, we could diagnose diseases, but we had oftentimes not the foggiest. When I went to medical school...
When you say not the foggiest, you mean as to what caused the disease?
Cause and therapy. For example, a disease well known like heart failure. Mm-hmm. We had at that time no real diuretics. We had one injectable known as thiamine, but we didn't have hydrodiureal. We didn't have Lasix. We had none of those things. See? And it was a very complicated process of getting rid of that fluid.
So you're talking late 50s, early 60s?
Early,
Is that the
well, I went in school 53 to 57, so that was about right smack in the middle, see.
So we're looking at about 50 to 60 years ago as we talk about this.
Yes, because Diarrheal came out in 58 when I was an intern, and the first patient we put on Diarrheal almost died because we didn't know about the potassium excretion, and this patient went into heart failure because the potassium went down, and he got arrhythmias and terrible things. Until we learned that it just didn't get rid of the sodium, it also got rid of all the other salts.
So it sounds like a bit of a hit or miss situation as you're trying new things.
It was so exciting. The genesis of it was fascinating in itself, in that it was actually discovered in England by a nurse who noticed that people who were treated with penicillin did not put out as much urine as the soldiers who were treated with sulfur drug. And she mentioned that to a physician who happened to be a research physician, even though he was in the Army at the time. And when he got out, he mentioned this to his company, and they started to do some research on it. And lo and behold, Diarrheal was born. And within a few years, hydrodiarrheal, which was 10 times stronger and more effective.
So almost a bit of happenstance there. Had the nurse not noticed that and shared it with the different people that she did, maybe we wouldn't have taken that path. Do you find happenstance was key throughout your life as you moved from that, the research, your love of research, into general practitioner in Bernville, Pennsylvania?
Serendipity, I think.
Yeah.
You know, I never thought I'd be a general practitioner.
Did you start being a practitioner kicking and fighting? Did you want to be, or were you resigned to be?
No, I was resigned. I wanted to have a residency with Phil Custer in Philadelphia, but it was years before I could get another residency, so it was a matter of expediency. I went into practice. I lived in Bernville. I always wanted to live on a farm, and there was a doctor there, and I talked with him, and he said there's room for 2 doctors. So I rented space from him and started my practice. But,
that's a pretty simple kind of recap of that in the Cookie Doctor, and I really want you to. I downloaded mine on the Kindle. You can get it in hardback. You can get it in paperback. You have quite a few stories in there as to how that came about, how you came upon the farm. By that time, you had already met the love of your life, and I believe you had a child when you bought the farm.
I actually had 2.
You had 2 at that point.
Patty and Steve, and I had an enormous amount of capital. I think altogether was 13 cents when I bought the farm. I was
13 cents went a long way back in 1950s, didn't it?
And I was $8,000 in the hole.
Oh my!
And as an intern, I was only going to make $200 a month. So, faced with those obstacles, I sought help from my father, who thought I was absolutely insane to think about buying a farm when I had no job. I was in debt, and I still had another 6 months of school. So, but I did it anyhow, and
that makes you quite the optimist. I do believe.
Well, you know, Joe, I have a faith in God, you know, and I believe in the old saying, God helps those who help themselves. Mm-hmm. But I prayed a lot, you know. I did an awful lot of praying, and I didn't know how I was going to make it. But what happened was I couldn't meet the mortgage. I couldn't meet the interest. And my father, even though he didn't like the idea, he moved in with me.
Oh, okay.
And with my little $200, he really carried the rest of us for a year until I got into practice. But
well, that took a while. At one point, I wondered why this was called The Cookie Doctor. And early on in the book, you tell the story, I believe it was a youngster called the office. You were called at all hours of the night, a true country doctor, house calls. And the bottom line was there wasn't money to pay you, and they gave you cookies.
I would get a lot of produce and sometimes chickens and ducks, and even got a cow one time and pigs.
A cow?
I lived on a farm, and these people, you know, they would do their best to pay. And I bring a story out about one fellow who came to me and he said, you know, I checked you out as a doctor and I want you for my doctor, but I can't pay you, except maybe 50 cents a month. And he had 3 children.
Oh, my.
And so I said, Eddie, that's, you know, it's fair enough. He said, but I want you to keep track of it because I will be able to pay you someday. I don't know when. And I did. I kept track of it. And over a year or 2 years, he ran up a bill. And I think it was something around $600. And one day he came in there with a big smile on his face. And he put down $200.
Wow.
He said, you're the first one I'm going to pay. And he told me all about how he left the farm, and well, he actually lived on a farm, but he got a job in Reading as a driver of construction equipment, and he made a lot of money. So, you know, I had faith in people. Just a very small percentage would stick you.
I notice all through the book, Dr. Pugliese, that your faith is very, very strong, and you offer that faith to patients that you met. When they came to you with various and sundry troubles, you invited them to pray on it and think about it. And the other thing that comes across very, very strong is your very being is made of compassion. Compassion for everybody you've met, and no judgment. No judgment, just compassion. And it's very touching. And I think we can learn. I've learned so much just reading your book and noticing that and thinking, am I that compassionate or am I that non-judgmental? It's a gift, and you've shared it with us in this book. How do you do that? It seems very natural.
Well, I think it's a lot of different things. I think I've been blessed, you know, and when I think of people who don't have the things that I had, you know, first, when you see tragedies, when you see a child die, and you have children, you don't know how blessed you are that they're doing all right. See, and so I just felt that I was given many gifts, and I was very pleased with what I had. And I had an extraordinary wife. You know, I oftentimes say that when I left the seminary and was in the service, I prayed for a wife, that God would send me a woman. See? And so I found Joanne, and if ever there was an angel, she was one. But we kind of had a little...
Was it love at first sight?
I think it was. I didn't know it was going to last 61 years, but yes, she was an absolute stunning woman. She was a composite of my mother, my Aunt Marina, and my Aunt Teresa. And those are the 3 main women in my life.
When you say a composite, I'm guessing you don't just mean her appearance, rather who she was.
Yeah, each, you know, one was tall, one was extremely gentle, one was extraordinary kind, see, and Joanne was all those things, besides being exceptionally beautiful.
Do you believe because she was all those things, and you mentioned extraordinarily kind, did that push you and compel you to be kind as well?
It helped me to understand, you know, that the way that her kindness was different than mine. She was German and more withdrawn, but you heard the expression, you know, it's so kind you wouldn't step on an ant, you know. Joanne wasn't that kind of a kindness. She felt a lot of pain in her life, and she lost her dad, who left them, and she went through a lot of deprivation, and she sensed that for people. And I think that was the part that was extraordinary about her.
There's a lot extraordinary about Joanne, about you,
Yeah.
Dr. Pugliese,
Yeah.
and about this book, and there's so much more to tell. We'll find out more in part 2 of What's the Story here on thepeoplechronicles.com.